Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
I want to tell a story, very short story that may be familiar to all of us Jews. There was once a brutally oppressive regime whose capital city sat on the banks of the Nile River. His country contained thousands of workers who were not native to the land and came from elsewhere. Eventually, these people decided the time was right to flee the country. Taking only what they could carry, they walked until they reached the Red Sea. Miraculously, they were able to cross the Red Sea to safety on the other side. But while they were seemingly safe, their journey wasn't over yet. They were still very far from home. I want to ask you now, how many of us know this story? For those who follow the international news closely, it seems that the events of the Exodus story have come to life in recent weeks. But the situation is very different, actually, than the one that happened in the Torah. It's quite unsettling. I'm not talking about what happened to the Jews in Egypt. I'm talking about what's happening right now in Sudan. Not enough people are talking in this country about what's happening in Sudan. Perhaps some of us have heard it on the news, in an online post, or on the radio, but I feel like not a lot of Americans are taking the time to learn about or understand the situation. And as human beings, we should all care about what's happening right now in Sudan. I'm going to be talking about it from a Jewish American perspective. There will be some politics involved, but this is not about right or left. In fact, the situation in Sudan right now seems to me almost trivial to the leaders of both of our traditional parties. A brief summary of what's going on in Sudan. Major fighting erupted there on April 8th, and it's continued essentially nonstop despite numerous official ceasefires. The two groups in conflict with each other are the Sudanese Armed Forces, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the powerful militant group, the Rapid Support Forces, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, usually referred to as Hemedti. As for who is right and who is wrong, it's not that simple. They entered into a fragile power-sharing agreement that was not bound to last long following the coup in 2019 that would supposedly bring a civilian-led government to the country. Hopes for such a government are now very faint. A lot of the power players in the global politics game are interested in a stable regime in Sudan. And Israel also has a great investment in what's happening in Sudan because in 2021, Sudan declared its intent to sign the Abraham Accords. It should have led to peace with Israel, but because the political instability in the region prevented them from actually completing all the work, the peace process has not formally yet been completed. We hope it will be soon. These events might get in the way of that. On the more human level, however, the streets of Sudan are now ruled by violence and lawlessness, especially in the capital city of Khartoum, which is plagued by bombs and airstrikes. Hundreds have been killed, thousands have been injured, and hundreds of thousands are either fleeing the country or are expected to in the next few weeks. People are without food, without water, without electricity, and even the hospitals are largely closed. People in Sudan might say to us, "What took you and the rest of the world so long to notice? Conditions here have been terrible even long before this fighting broke out." They would be right to say that. While the mass exodus of people fleeing across the Red Sea right now might seem like Torah, there are some important differences. It's not that the people aren't Jewish. God made all of our lives equal, Jewish or not. The issue is the reason these people are able to leave across the Red Sea. God is not miraculously parting the waters for them. These people are fleeing in ships to Saudi Arabia across the sea. They're being evacuated by people in other countries, by groups like the US Navy. And they aren't willing to evacuate just anyone. Only those who have a foreign passport are being rescued, often having to choose to stay with their family or to leave their family behind. Those who don't have a foreign passport are fleeing to neighboring countries like Chad and South Sudan. People in those countries have terrible living conditions that aren't much better, and in some ways worse, than what they had in Sudan. Perhaps you can see why, from a Jewish perspective, I take such big issue with these events. The world's biggest players aren't doing enough to help the refugees, only their own nationals. And as I'll mention later, our country has even admitted that it has room for refugees should it choose to admit them. As Americans, of course, we have an obligation to rescue our own nationals who are living in Sudan. But I'm ashamed America hasn't said it wouldn't be willing to admit Sudanese refugees. It seems that we haven't learned our lesson as a country from 1939, when America refused to admit the 900 plus Jewish refugees on the ship St. Louis who were fleeing Nazi Germany. That ship was forced to turn around back towards Europe. Leviticus 19:18 says, "Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," love your fellow as yourself. But less known in that chapter is verse 34, which says to love the stranger as ourselves, for we were strangers in the land of Egypt. In his commentary on this verse, the Shadal says that this commandment was in great contrast to the values of the other nations of the ancient world, for they would only love their own people, not the stranger. Judaism takes a very, very clear position about refugees. In the Mishnah Torah, it says that when war breaks out, a city may only be surrounded on 3 sides, leaving room for refugees to escape. Psalms 39:13 says, "Hear my cry, O God. Do not disregard my tears, for I, like my ancestors, am an alien." The Jewish value of welcoming guests is called Hachnasat Orchim. And in Genesis 18, Abraham cared so much about this value that he chose to prioritize being a good host for needy travelers instead of having a conversation with Hashem. This shows that hospitality and caring for the needy is more important than anything spiritual. God is patient. God will wait. The end of Donald Trump's presidency, the incoming refugee cap for America in 2021 was set to be 15,000 people, a historic low. In defense of President Trump, COVID-19 certainly made those numbers lower than anybody would have wanted them to be. When Joe Biden became president, he recognized that this number was far too low. He set out to fix it, saying the United States Refugee Admissions Program embodies America's commitment to protect the most vulnerable and to stand as a beacon of liberty and refuge to the world. It's a statement about who we are and who we want to be. And while it may sound like President Biden's words reflect Jewish values, in actuality, he raised the refugee limit this year to 125,000, up from what it used to be 15,000. And yet, only 26,000 refugees have been admitted to America since Biden became president. So he may have said one thing, but actually the numbers tell a very different story. Instead of saying to the world that he would bring them into our country, he said to the Sudanese leadership, "I'm going to simply put sanctions on your country." Given that American presidents on both the right and the left seem to have failed to do right by the refugees, it's easy for us as Americans and as Jews to become disheartened and feel powerless. After all, what can we possibly do in a situation like this? Well, while it might not seem like there's much, actually, they need our help more than ever. There is something we can do. First of all, and this sounds obvious, but tzedakah at this time is so important. With hundreds of thousands of people trapped and stranded in Sudan, they need our help to supply them with food, water, and medical care, all of which right now are very lacking. Even the neighboring countries, especially Chad, which are absorbing the refugees, have almost no food. And they certainly don't have enough food for their own people, yet alone the people who are now joining them in Chad. Those countries also need our tzedakah. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNICEF, and the International Rescue Committee are just 3 tzedakahs that you can choose from. There are many more. I made a point of donating earlier this week. But we can also do our part simply by talking about what's happening. Post about it online. Tell your friends. Put it in an email. Let the people of Sudan know, even if they themselves don't have internet, that we are not deaf to their cries. And finally, while it's not in our power to admit refugees into this country ourselves, it is certainly in our power to make the refugees who are here feel welcome. We should help them, we should befriend them, for they are often still oppressed in one or more ways. We Jews know what it's like to live in a country that sometimes seems unwelcoming to us. Of course, we can also expand our definition of what a refugee is to include the general homeless population in this country. There are many homeless people even here in Ventura, and in that respect, I'm very proud to say that HaYam already does quite a lot to help them. So thank you to all who are involved in HaYam's efforts to help the homeless here in Ventura. The message tonight is twofold. Just because you can't fix the bigger problems doesn't mean you shouldn't take the time to learn about it. And also, while we might not be able to do everything we want, we can still make a dent in things on the smaller, more human scale. For to do the work, even if it doesn't seem like much, is a big part of what it means to be a Jew. I hope and pray that things in Sudan get better very, very quickly. Shabbat Shalom. We're on page